Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Revolution 250 podcast. I am Bob Allison. I chair the Rev 250 Advisory Group. We are a consortium of 75 organizations in Massachusetts planning ways to observe the 250th anniversaries of the American Revolution. And our guest today is Gordon Harris. Gordon Harris comes to us from Ipswich, where he is. Would you say you're the town historian?
Yeah, I was appointed town historian about a dozen years ago.
And he's also the owner and proprietor of the Historic Ipswich website, historicipswich.net, which has all kinds of things on the history of this really interesting place.
I call it my irrational obsession. I moved here about 24 years ago, and at the time I was leading bicycle tours, and I just really started mapping out the historic houses in the town because my initial interest is in historic architecture. I made carpentry my career, and I moved to this town because I found it so fascinating. But then the town powers saw my interactive map on Google Maps and said, "Hey, you got to join the historical commission," and that's here I've been on the historical commission for quite a number of years.
Right, and you've won the town's Mary Conley Award for historic preservation for your work.
Yeah, that was especially for the website, and also for when I was a chair many years ago. We actually don't have a local historic district in this town, like many towns. That would be the kind of historic district where they tell you what color you can paint your house, things like that.
Yeah,
the town of Ipswich tends to be, I guess the best word may be libertarian. We go way back to 1687. We have this motto that we're the birthplace of American independence, and it's basically, don't tell us what to do, we'll do the right thing.
And that works.
Yeah, it works. You drive into downtown Ipswich and you see that we have one of the oddest intersections that you ever saw. Was, I think, 7 roads feeding into it right in the middle of town. And we just like it perfectly fine that way. If you don't like it, well, you don't complain. Stay around for a while, you'll understand.
Or move somewhere else.
Yeah, it's that kind of town. It's an awesome place to live. People who live here love it so much that they also fight about it a little bit.
That's great. And there are about 60 houses in town that date to the first period. That is the 17th century, very early 18th century.
Yeah, I think at the latest count, I ruled out a few that are just obviously not first period. 59 houses that have some element in them, either completely or partially dating to what we call the first period, and that's of English colonial construction. You can identify a first period house by the exposed woodwork inside, the chamfered summer beams, things like that.
Okay. And let's get back to that whole story, the birthplace of American independence. What's that?
Well, after the Massachusetts Bay Colony was founded and Ipswich was settled 1633, was incorporated 1634, we were kind of allowed to be on our own. The English were busy with their Civil War, and it wasn't until Charles II was the throne was put back on the throne that he knows, hey, where's all that money that we're supposed to get through this charter with the colony? And of course, we weren't, especially the trade with the Indies, etc. So a series of acts called the Navigation Acts were passed, and basically, it kind of restructured how town meetings could act, how trade was done, and how tea yet again was one of the things, and sugar, etc. With this all, here we are, something like 70 years before the Revolution. The same kind of thing is going on, and H Town was ordered to appoint a tax collector by the Crown appointed governor. That was Governor Andros. So this town, we had this minister in the part of Ipswich, which is now the town of Essex. His name was the Reverend John Wise. He was really outraged. He was quite a rabble rouser, and he basically flew into town on his horse, and he met with some of the most prominent men in the town, the town selectman, the town clerk, John Appleton, Samuel Appleton, John Andrews, and others, and called a town meeting the next day, I think, and the town voted unanimously not to appoint a tax collector. Wow. So that really outraged Andros. He sent his his troops here, and they arrested these guys, and some of them ended up in jail for quite a while.
Mhm.
It was only a couple of years later that basically the same thing happened in Boston. The Glorious Revolution. They got word that the Glorious Revolution happened, and William and Mary on the throne, and they captured Andros and shipped him off to England again.
Yeah, yeah, it's unusual to say the least to have the royal governor arrested, and started by this rabble rouser up in Ipswich, Reverend John Wise.
That's right. And at that time we're sort of out on the outskirts, where Ipswich is a very important town. It had a court here, and actually, as Boston, Ipswich, and Salem were some of the largest towns in the country at that early date. When we get forward to the Revolution, talking 70 years later, you start looking at it, Worcester and the Berkshires, and that's where the radicals really were at that time. Yeah. Really, they preceded some of the actions here. We give a lot of credit to Boston, but they were declared themselves in a state of nature out in the Berkshires. Actually, they wouldn't allow the courts to meet.
Right. Yeah. It is really a revolution that's happening in the minds of people all around Massachusetts. And Ipswich was mainly a fishing town at the time of the Revolution. Fishing, shipping. What were they doing for?
Yeah, boats were still small enough to come into our crummy little harbor, and the Revolutionary War, and then especially the War of 1812, the embargo, all of that really changed Ipswich. It became such a rundown place until the Revolutionary War. That a newspaper writer from Salem came to Ipswich and said all the houses in Ipswich are painted the same. They're brown. They don't have a lick of paint. It was basically the Revolutionary War with all the debts really put these towns quite in debt and bad circumstances. It was industrial revolution when, especially textile industry that brought these towns back.
Right. So between John Wise, the Ipswich uprising in 1687, and say the Revolution, and things are relatively. What brings them back as wanting independence in the 1770s?
Yeah, it's a great question, because it looks like things sort of settled down, and the Bay Colony's charter was changed. But it seemed to be agreeable after Andros was gone. And of course, the British were busy with the French and the Indians and sending our citizens off. So that was kind of the focus. A lot of other stuff is going on. We have King Philip's War, and the Salem witchcraft trials. All these things are happening. We get up to the Sugar Act and the Townsend Acts that were the precedent, I would say, to the intolerable acts that happened, a decade later. And that's, we think about the revolution coming up, in everybody's mind, it's 1776. That was kind of the culmination of really, the real revolution was happening for 10 years before that.
Oh, yeah. And there's a convention in Ipswich in 1774, a couple of conventions in Ipswich in 1774. That's
actually right. Two Ipswich conventions. So, the background is that Parliament passed these acts, the intolerable acts. And they closed down our courts, appointed their own judges. They closed down our town meetings. Only an annual town meeting could be held. And then only if the governor approved of the wording that was on there. We've been so self-rule for so long.
Yeah,
this really irritated and energized, especially the radicals in the population. Even though especially Salem and Newburyport, these are towns that are making a lot of money off of trade, and they're slower to to jump on. Even the Congress that was meeting in Philadelphia were slow to really call for breaking away. It took until 1776 to actually do that.
Yeah. So we're talking with Gordon Harris, the town historian from Ipswich, which is the birthplace of American independence.
Yeah.
And we're talking a little bit about Ipswich, which has this long history, but then, after Massachusetts gets its new charter, we have the governor is going to be appointed by the crown, but the assembly will be chosen by the voters in the towns. And for most of the next 70 years, they get along pretty well. There's no real big conflict of interest between what the empire wants and what Ipswich wants. But then we see around the 1760s, 1770s, it changes. And there's a very important political figure in Ipswich, Dr. John Califf, who apparently gets onto the wrong side of things in the 1760s.
And this was a guy that was really respected in the town. He had been a surgeon in the French and Indian Wars. They appointed him as our representative to the General Court. With the Sugar Act, they gave him specific instructions. And what really brought him down was the circular letter.
Governor Bernard's that wants them to the circular letter about the
and then the General Court was ordered by the governor to retract it. Right. He was one of only 12 that voted to retract. And there's this cartoon that it's credited to Paul Revere, where John Califf and these 12 representatives somebody herded into hell by the devil, and Califf, because I think his name may have been pronounced Califf, so he looks like he has a calf head on.
Wow. Yeah. That's fascinating. So it's not just we disagree with this particular stand you took, but you're going directly to hell for having done it.
The radicals, they never forgave him. When the war actually, the battles began, Lexington conquered, and here we are, quite a few years later. The radicals in the town surrounded his house and demanded he come out and apologize for his actions, and they were going to burn his house down. He came close to being tarred and feathered. He eventually fled to New Brunswick and became a surgeon for the British. And so it's interesting that his house is still standing, but it was moved about a block and a half down the street. And where his house was is where the Ipswich Museum is now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
That's, when I'm working on my site, this is the thing that really makes me keep coming back to the site, is that in this town you have all of these houses and you have this old graveyard, and then you have these stories like what we're just telling, and you can walk down the streets of Ipswich and you've got the history and everything. There's it's not just a house with architecture. You're really walking back into history in this town and a lot of North Shore towns. And whereas Old Sturbridge and places like that, historic Deerfield, are really, really interesting. People live in these houses. This is amazing to live in.
It is. It really is amazing. So it's not a living history museum, but you do get to see these layers of the past. And your website, Historic Ipswich, really does a good job with that, showing the things that have happened over these 4 centuries of Ipswich's history.
It's up to about 1,300 pages now, and the site gets, I think during COVID, it got over 500,000 page views that year.
Wow. Pretty good.
Yeah.
Pretty good. So it's historicipswich.net, which has lots on the architecture, the history, the early residents of the town. A tremendous resource and really a model for what a town historian can do, putting together these stories so other people can enjoy them. But you started this because you were biking around and making a bike trip.
Let me make it clear that my degree in college was in sociology, and the last thing I wanted to do was spend my life at a desk listening to people complain. As a social worker, I wanted to be outside. I became a carpenter kind of by accident, and but it worked out fine for 50 years. That's what I did, and still I can't quite get away from my carpentry clients. But I do find the architecture of this town fascinating.
It is.
Yeah.
If I may ask, how do you become a carpenter by accident?
I didn't take shop in school. My father was a minister. I don't know if you mentioned I grew up in Mississippi, and I was fortunate to have fairly liberal parents for that rather backwards place. But after graduating from college, the year before, I came up to work in the Berkshires at a summer camp. And I said, "Here's a place where people are kind of like me." And it wasn't, after graduating, came back here. I wasn't really as much of a student of history back then as I wanted to be. I was, although my father always said, really should be a historian. When I was living in the Berkshires, and I came back and I lived there for 30 years, I wasn't aware of how important a role Berkshire County played actually in the Revolution. So before we had Lexington and Concord, Sheffield, Mass, and Great Barrington, Mass, Pittsfield, they voted not to allow the court to sit after the abominable acts or intolerable acts. I don't think they actually used any of those words at the they may have referred to them as intolerable, but some of the names of these things, even a Boston Massacre, these are all labels that we've given later to the Tea Party. But they out in the Berkshires, they took action immediately and prevented these unanimous counselors, the judges, from sitting, and declared the Berkshires to be in a state of nature. Worcester wasn't very far behind, and then right before, while the Continental Congress was meeting in Philadelphia, there was this false alarm. False alarm, and these are people from streaming out of the Western Massachusetts and even Connecticut and further south, and to get almost to Boston, thinking that the city had been burned, and finding actually it wasn't. But they were mobilized. They were ready to go.
Oh yeah, that's good. And then, of course, the men from Ipswich too. You say they leave. They get the alarm in April of 1775 and head off immediately.
They set off. If when I'm reading the history, they always write that a person or a group of people when they marched to the alarm, and I always wonder, well, what do they mean by that? It means they didn't get there in time. But there was this rather interesting event that happened while they marched off. I guess it must have been the night after the Lexington conquered, and all the Minutemen, they were excited. They thought this thing was going to be over pretty fast. They march off. Of course, they don't get there in time, and while they're gone, there was this thing called the Great Ipswich Fright. The British were always patrolling our coast. And occasionally they would send a little boat in, and they would try to catch a couple of sheep or something, get some mutton. So this apparently happened, and alarmed someone who ran into town and said, "The British here," and they heard a screaming. It was probably the screaming of a sheep, but they believed that the men and women were being slaughtered, and by the time this rumor got into town, they were burning everything in their path. They were coming, and they were going to slaughter men and women. So people of Ipswich ran off towards Raleigh. Of course, people in Raleigh continued. They all ran to Newbury. Eventually, all of the North Shore seems to have vacated up into New Hampshire. In a period of less than 24 hours.
Well, and this is because all the militia had marched off to Lexington and Concord.
There was nobody to defend them. Now there was a group of soldiers who were coming down from New Hampshire on their way, and they passed it. When they got to Ipswich, they saw that the people of Ipswich were in such a state of shock. They stayed to defend the town. Wow!
And so the screaming they heard was the bleating of the sheep.
Apparently so. Yeah. There was a number of humorous incidents. I think, Leslie's Retreat in Salem. It's where the Revolutionary War almost began.
Yeah. John Greenleaf Whittier wrote a poem about the Great Ipswich Fright too.
He did. Yeah, it's kind of come down in history that way.
Yeah. And then you also have on the historic Ipswich site a thing about Paul Revere's less famous ride through Ipswich in December of 1774.
Yeah, this man is pretty amazing. He was heavy duty. He and this was winter, right? So he gallops from Boston all the way up to Portsmouth to warn them that their fort is that the British are on the way to capture the fort and take the munitions out of there. He gets there before the British do, I guess, and the people in the town of Portsmouth took care of the fort themselves. And he certainly would have stopped in Ipswich to change horses.
Mm-hmm.
We have an inn. We had an inn there, Treadwell's Inn, and the place is still standing. The building's still standing. So many are, and that would have been the place where he would have stopped and gotten a fresh horse and continued on. And I would not be surprised if he was pamphleting every town along the way.
Right. Yeah.
Certainly, he would have stopped along on the way back and talked to members of the committees of correspondence.
Mm-hmm. Right. We're talking with Gordon Harris, the historian from the town of Ipswich and the proprietor of the Historic Ipswich website, historicipswich.net. Mm-hmm. And part of your site has a great section on Ipswich and the breach with Boston, where you have these different episodes that happened in Ipswich. So what most surprises you, or what's the story you find most interesting in all of this, looking at how Ipswich is responding to these troubles with?
Well, that's sort of evolving because fortunately, our town archives has all of these the original documents from the town meetings. So quite a few town meetings are happening, and every time something happened in Boston, in particular, whether it was the tea being dumped into the harbor, the Boston Massacre, a town meeting was called, and the votes would be unanimous usually.
Yeah, it's amazing. After they got rid of John Califf.
Yeah. General Michael Farley became our representative, and he was our representative to the General Court, and then after Gage moved it to Salem, then the Provincial Congress, he was our representative to that. He's an interesting fellow too. He was from a family of millers, and he became a general in the Massachusetts Army, but he was by that time he was age 60, so they determined he was too old to have to fight. He was not part of the elite, but he rose to quite a bit of recognition in the town and in the province.
That's interesting.
One of the really most important stories, I think, from Ipswich are the letters of Joseph Hutchins, Colonel Joseph Hutchins, who was working with Colonel Wade and his wife Sarah Perkins. And during the Revolutionary War, Joseph Hutchins, he and Colonel Wade were at Bunker Hill. They went into Boston, and they were in that part of that huge encampment around the city that was basically keeping Boston prisoner. Then when General Washington, after that, moved the soldiers south, that contingent went down to Rhode Island, and there was quite a bit of action going, as you probably know there. They went on the Long Island, and they were with Washington during those horrible winters, Valley Forge, and I believe he even eventually was at Ticonderoga. So there was something like maybe a couple hundred letters total that he wrote, or that his wife wrote in reply. And in some cases, those are our only record of what was actually going on, and especially in Long Island and Rhode Island. So what I've done with those on my site is the letters were collected and a book was written. As you might expect, that these were just, he was a working guy. He was a cobbler. Even those poor soldiers, sometimes didn't even have shoes.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So his grammar was certainly nothing. It's difficult to read the original handwriting. Difficult to read the text. So what I did on my site is I took the liberty to correct the spelling so that it's easier to read. and it does make it flow better. It's still the same words. I didn't try to change even the expressions, the kind of expressions that we may not use today, but I would encourage people to read that because it was really horrible. These guys just don't know how they survived with things like that. This is a different kind of human being than what we are today.
I think so. Yeah.
We would be having a hard time today if our internet went down, but these guys were fighting without clothing and shoes in the winter.
Yeah, it's amazing. And again, we struggle to find the perspective of the so-called ordinary person. And here you have a cobbler who's part of this, and he and his wife are writing back and forth, and you do get this first person, this really vivid account of what he is seeing and what the soldiers are experiencing from his letters.
Yeah. He did. You know, they didn't all have to stay. He decided he was going to, stay the full time. And I think this is really for many people it's the unknown story of the Revolutionary War. Certainly. These actions that the British Parliament took with the Townshend Acts and then later on with the Intolerable Acts, they certainly aggravated the rich people as well. I mean, because they're making money trading with the British. There was sort of reluctance to go the full distance and declare ourselves independent because there was money involved here. But when you go down into places like Worcester and the Berkshires, Hampshire County, etc., these are mostly farmers, maybe a few mechanics. The mechanics and the farmers were, they were ready to fight with pitchforks and clubs and old outdated muskets, whatever they had. The times must have been, basically living off the land, hand to mouth. And we see that again in Shays' Rebellion after the Revolutionary War. The same thing is happening again out there in the same places.
Right. Can you tell us what happens to Joseph Hutchins and Sarah Perk after the war?
Yeah, Sarah was his second wife. Said that many men had even 3 or 4 wives because their wives died in childbirth. Both of their gravestones are there in the Old North burial ground, and so he remarried, and when he came back, he became a very quiet person. It reminds me of my father. He was in a plane in Europe in World War II, and these guys didn't want to come home and talk about the war either. And my impression is that, especially with Joseph Hotchkiss, he didn't. He kind of withdrew, but he married. His second wife died. He married again, and eventually he owned the Whipple House. So that's our most historic house here in town. It dates back to 1674, I think, the date. The oldest part of it. It's a wonderful first period house. It's a high end first period house because John Whipple was fairly wealthy, and Joseph Hotchkiss ended up owning that in the decade before his death. So he had several properties. I know that because I've looked back at the deeds. So he was a hardworking guy, but he's I think it's really good to read the story. It would give you people. It would make people wonder how we ever won this war.
Right.
What they went through.
Right. It's amazing. We're talking with Gordon Harris, the Ipswich town historian and keeper of the historic Ipswich website, leader of tours by bike and other means in and around Ipswich. And does Ipswich have any plans for the 250th? Yeah, I mean, it's tremendous. You have all of this material available, the town records, stories like Joseph Hodgkins. I mean, do you have plans for commemoration?
So there's a couple of things that we're thinking of. One is this will be an easy one. This will a theatrical reading of the letters between Hotchkiss and his wife Sarah. We can wait a while on that, a couple of years, because that that would be in the, say, 1776 into about 1780 or so.
Yeah.
The other one is this amazing event that happened before the Revolutionary War in 1774. I look back at 1774 and say, this is kind of when the revolution really began.
It is. Yeah.
I'm sure you could probably tell the history better than I can, but General Gage, the governor, took the general court out of Boston and put it in Salem, thinking that these rich merchants in Salem would be more accommodating. Turned out that things didn't go any better there, and he eventually forbade them from meeting. So they called these conventions for every county, and so every county had a convention with most of the towns coming in. We had one right here in Ipswich. I think the best known one is probably the Suffolk Convention, because here takes the piece of that and rides off to the Continental Congress and tells them what's going on. Yeah. But the Ipswich Convention, September 6th, 1774, it was representatives from every town in Essex County.
But they meet at the Treadwell Inn, right? The Treadwell Tavern.
That's amazing. Now that building is still standing, and it's a wonderful 1735 or so house right there at the North Green, right across from the church. Now, just a tiny little aside, there always had to be inns and taverns in the center of these towns, because the stagecoaches or whatever, how they were traveling. And before 1700, we didn't even have a courthouse. So court was held in these inns, court areas. So there was an inn preceded that one, only 2 doors down, still standing. It's called Sparks Tavern. Now, Sparks Tavern was an even more interesting place because of two things. One is that's probably where John Samuel Appleton and John Wise got together, had a few drinks, had some ale, and then the town meeting probably happened right there, because they didn't have a townhouse yet. They always met in a tavern, so that's almost certain that they met there. And just one more little aside, as when the Salem witchcraft trials were ended by the governor because his own wife had been pointed out as a witch, there's still all of these men and women who had been accused, and their cases had to be determined, had to be tried. So they brought it to Ipswich. I think there might have been as many as a couple hundred still outstanding cases. And we let all go except I think 4 tried and found them innocent. And Ipswich, they won't tell you this in Salem, but Ipswich is where the Salem witchcraft trials ended. So it was at Sparks Tavern, and behind Sparks Tavern and Treadwell's, because of the way the road curves right there, there was a large tavern building back behind it. So studying that, we've seen what looks like an old foundation. So this would be large enough that representatives from all of these towns could come for this convention that was held in 1774.
And they couldn't meet in Salem because the governor was there, and it was being occupied by the British. So they,
So they passed a number of resolutions, and I can give you just a kind of a quick rundown of what those 8 resolutions were. Number one, they bound all of the delegates to pursue all reasonable measures by which the intolerable acts may be defeated. Number 2, they voted that only the judges and other civil officers that have been appointed by the previous government would be obeyed.
Because the new dispensation was the governor would appoint the judges and all of these officials. So they're insisting, no, we get to appoint the judges and these other officials.
And I think they call these crown-appointed judges the maximus counselors.
Right, yeah.
Which I believe means something like appointed by a higher authority, something of that sort. And they also voted that any of these maximus counselors, civil officers, who did conduct in conformity with the Parliament's Act, would be considered, quote, malignant enemies of the country. This is the kind of wording when you look back to these town resolutions that happened after everything was going on. And seriously, Parliament was shooting itself in the foot all along the way. Everything they did was probably exactly the opposite of what they should have done. The 4th resolve was regarding a guy named Peter Fry, and he had been the leader of the militia that General Gage had tried to send to Salem to shut down the legislature. But apparently Peter Fry refused to go in, and so they deleted that once they realized that he really hadn't committed a crime against the people. But there was a judge, William Brown in Salem, that they established a delegation to go and visit him and acquaint him with the grief that this country viewed his exertions by carrying out the acts of Parliament. So we're getting to the point here where we're beginning to take some control of the situation ourselves.
Right. Yeah.
Then we agreed that all town meetings in Essex County could be called agreeably according to the historic usage. Call. And this is one of the most very important things that happened here is our Essex County meeting in Ipswich voted that a provincial government is necessary and that a general assembly would be held at Salem on the 5th of October to choose representatives to a provincial Congress. And as you know, they did meet, even though Gage tried to stop them.
Right.
And they met very, very quickly. Chose delegates, I think, with John Hancock as their the speaker for the, and they agreed that it would meet in Congress. And then, of course, that provincial Congress went on, eventually began meeting, I think, in Cambridge.
Yeah. So this is fascinating. So that, by the way, Judge Brown later becomes the governor of Bermuda, and the house he lived in was really at the intersection of Marblehead, Swampscott, and Salem. And then John Glover comes into possession of it. And right now there's an effort to save it. Apparently it's threatened with demolition. So there's an effort to save the Glover house, which dates back then to, Glover got it because Brown had vacated it.
I think it's still standing. I know last year it was being debated. In this, which something similar happened. The General Michael Farley was really, really, really important man in the town. And his house was right in the very center of town, right across from our post office. And I have these photos that were taken when our post office was being built back during the Depression era. And the house had already kind of become this is the 1930s. It has gas pumps along the side of it.
Oh wow!
They demolished it and they built a service station. They demolished a beautiful George and Michael Farley's house. And it now it's the Cumbies. You can't take it back after it's done.
No, you really can't. So fortunately, though, you've saved many houses in Ipswich, and you've mapped them, showing where they are, which is a way of showing how important these places are. So it's not just, and you really did the work of digging in and figuring out which are the first period houses, which are the historic houses, and getting the stories of the people who lived in them.
Well, I want to make sure I don't give myself too much credit here. What I saw when I came to Ipswich is that this was one of the most documented places on the face of the earth. We had this wonderful congregational minister in the late 19th century, Thomas Franklin Waters, who, when he retired, he went on to establish the Ipswich Historical Society. They bought the Whipple House, which was in a state of tremendous disrepair, and restored it. He went on to write numerous essays and reports every year to the Historical Society, and eventually assembled all that into a 2-volume set called Ipswich and the Massachusetts Bay Colony.
Amazing.
His research was phenomenal. I have found, I think, only one time when he was unfamiliar with a later, with the history of a house. He not only wrote the history of every house. That's what he was as obsessed as I am. He always put the book and page number from the deeds, and of course now we can go in our county, Salem, Essex County. We can go to Essex County deeds, and we can see those actual deeds just online. It's an amazing thing to be able to do. So all of us was here, and everybody that moves to the town apparently becomes an historian sooner or later. and so many people, and people who've grown up here as well have written about the town. What I did was basically said, this has got to be online. How many people are going to be able to go to find this document somewhere in a library?
Right. Yeah.
And why should everybody have to go and do that on their own? If I put this on the web, everybody can see it. And really, it's been very flattering, the success. I can't walk down the street in Ipswich without people waving, saying, "Hi, Gordon." I got to confess, you don't usually know who they are, but I wave back. And so I found the place that I belong. I had to be like 50 years old before it happened.
That's great. I'm glad it happened for you, and I'm glad it happened for Ipswich. So
yeah, thank you.
So we've been talking with Gordon Harris, who is a historian of Ipswich and the keeper of the historic Ipswich.net website, and great stuff on the website and great things happening in Ipswich, and great things happened in Ipswich in the period we've been talking about. So thanks for joining us. And
and fun.
I want to thank Jonathan Lane, our producer, the man behind the curtain, as well as our listeners around Massachusetts and around the world. And every week I thank folks in different places. If you're in one of these places and you want to connect with Jonathan Lane and get some of our Revolution 250 swag, send him an email at jlane@revolution250.org, and he'll send you one of our calendars or one of our lapel pins. And it's good to hear from folks around the country. And this week I'm thanking folks in Houston, Texas, and in Edinburgh, Scotland, and here in the Bay State, in Malden, Charlestown, Brighton, and of course a special thank you to the folks in Lexington. And there's a great website, lexington250.com, that'll tell you what's happening there in Lexington, at the Lexington Green and other places, Lafayette, Louisiana, Pelican Rapids, Minnesota, Duluth, Georgia, Steubenville, Ohio, and Lutz, Tampa, and Sarasota in Florida. Thank you all of those places and places between and beyond. Thank you, Gordon, for joining us.
It's amazing.
And now we will be piped out on the road to Boston.